Welcome to the Wildy West, a podcast dedicated to being a voice for wild horses. My name is Chase McGoran, and I will be your host. Let's save these horses together. All I ask you to do is listen. According to a blog post on the United Nations website from 2019, at least 680 vertebrate species have been driven to extinction since the 16th century by humans. Over 9% of all domesticated breeds of mammals used for food and agriculture have become extinct as of 2016, and thousands more are threatened. A quick Google search does not put the Alberta mountain horse on this list. In fact, looking through Google, other than the ZooCheck website, it is hard to find any information or good articles on these horses that is not an opinion piece. What I do know, however, is Alberta's Wildies, also known as the Alberta mountain horse, are in danger. Today, I will be discussing the Feral Horse Management Framework, a plan put into place by the Canadian government. Whatever name they want to give it, it amounts to equine genocide. I will also be talking more about their assertion that wild horses cause such extensive damage to the landscape that they need to be culled in order to preserve the ecological balance. There aren't many Alberta mountain horses left in the wild. In fact, there are less than 1,500. When I first heard this number, it felt wrong that these rare horses were not on an endangered species list. I felt validated then when I found out that the International Union for Conservation of Nature, or the IUCN, defines an endangered species as any population containing less than 2,500 mature adults. Our wildies are about half of that. This makes government plans for a culls all the more shocking to me. The number of these horses is already so low, and there are already so few of these beautiful creatures left on the landscape. So why does the Canadian government insist that they need to be killed? My guest today is Dr. Claudia Notzke, a wild horse expert, researcher, geographer, and professor emerita at the University of Lethbridge. She is a lifelong equestrian and outdoors enthusiast. Horses, wild and tame, have always been part of her life. For her research program entitled The Wild/Feral Horse in North America, Wildlife, Cultural Heritage, or Ecological Intruder, Claudia traveled through BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Montana, Wyoming, and North and South Dakota. Her research on wild horse populations has also taken her to Namibia, Mongolia, Germany, and Sable Island in Nova Scotia. She has numerous research publications about wild horses and continues to be a tireless wildy advocate in the fight to protect these magnificent horses and their right to remain living free on the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. Thank you so much for joining us, Claudia. It's really cool that you made some time out of your Christmas month to come and talk to us. Our first question is, what first got you interested in studying wild horses?
Well, I've always been a horse person all my life, and wild horses as well as tame horses, even as a child, were very close to what I liked. And I followed the fate of wild horses throughout my entire life. And then when in just 10 years prior to my retirement, I was looking for a new research project. And it was really interesting, even though I had a short list of pretty interesting stuff that I might have engaged with. At that particular time, there was just news item after news item after news item about crises of wild horses in the States and other countries and also in Canada. And it was literally like they were calling me. And as a result, I thought, well, that's a perfect project. And that's pretty much determined the next 10 years of my life. And I'm still very engaged with it after retirement, so I'm still engaged with advocacy. But it was definitely the perfect topic for me to spend a lot of time with, personal as well as professional.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Can you give us an overview of the history of the wild horse in North America?
It's a really interesting question, and I take it to mean the natural history of those animals as well as their history in association with our own species. Mm-hmm. It's also a really good starting point for learning about our wild horses, because wild horse history debunks the most frequent myth that are being advanced to challenge their very right to even exist in North America and in North America in general, but particularly also for our Wildies in Alberta. I always like to start out by saying that the wild horse is North America's gift to the world, because wild horses originated right here in North America. The whole family of wild horses originated in North America about 60 million years ago as a tiny little terrier-size animal looking nothing like modern horses, with multiple toes, with a very different diet. So they're very different animals. Mm-hmm. And after that, we are looking at millions and millions of years of evolution, where these animals spread over the subcontinent, where they grew in size, where they reduced the number of their toes till they had just one hoof, like our horses. And that happened, some people say about 3 or 4 million years ago, others say 2 million years ago, but that doesn't really matter, because the fact remains that something like the modern horse after that spent over hundreds of millions of years spread throughout this continent, developing different ecotypes adjusted to different environments, and undergoing migrations to Asia, return migrations to North America, extinctions. And the very last extinction occurred started about 10 or 12,000 years ago, not only affecting horses, but also other large mammals populating the Ice Age steppe. And the very last type of wild horse to go extinct in North America was Equus lumbi, or the Yukon horse, and that only happened 5,000 years ago. And that's really important to realize, because 5,000 years ago in ecological terms of time is just a blink of an eye. And then 500 years ago, things came full circle, mm-hmm. when Christopher Columbus introduced the Spanish horse to North America. Mm-hmm. That was in 1519, when he, on his second voyage to the Americas, when he brought Spanish horses into modern-day Mexico. And their northward spread then was, at first, Spanish colonization moved north to what is today the southwestern United States. And from there, the spread of horses northward up to Canada was facilitated by horses escaping their owners, mm-hmm. but also, and particularly importantly, due to the trade by Native Americans trading horses to other Native American nations, and eventually ending up in Canada, and presumably also wild horse herds expanding their range. So there are various factors at play, but at that time, definitely horses spread throughout the North American continent. And it was probably the mid-1600s that they reached the northern plains and the northern mountains. Now, that's the generally accepted version of the story. There's also another line of thought, namely that the original North American horses on this continent never went extinct in the first place. And there's increasing evidence, and some people even say it's suppressed evidence in the form of fossils, in the form of rock engravings, petroglyphs, geoglyphs, which are shapes formed out of rocks. But most importantly, the oral tradition of Native Americans and First Nations. And they claim that throughout all this time, actually small remnants of lineages of the original North American horse continue to survive. We will never know that. I mean, the jury is still out on that one. But I certainly think it bears keeping an open mind. And there are constantly new findings that may force us to revise our ideas about the horse's history in North America. Now, talking about Alberta in particular, wild horses in the Rocky Mountains and in the vicinity, also on the plains, they have probably been here for about 300 years or more. And that's based on explorers' journals, but it's also based on First Nations and Native American oral history. And it certainly looks like horses were around where we find wild horses today for 300 years or even longer than that. And they numbered in the tens of thousands. It was a very large population. And continuing talking about history, we also have to look at the genetics because they tell their own story. And even looking at our Wildies today, you know, you can see their story written in their bodies, so to speak. Recently, we had a genetic analysis done of our Alberta Wildies by Gus Cawthron, who is a world-renowned geneticist at a university in Texas. And what he found was that there was a very strong predominance of Iberian DNA in our wild horses. And that is a hugely important characteristic because when we look at all the Mustangs, the Mustang herds in the United States, there are only 4 that exhibit any Iberian lineage. So what this tells us is that these horses have been where they are today for a very, very long time, that these horses are actually descended from the Spanish colonial horses that were brought over in the 15th and 16th century and were traded northward by Native Americans and established themselves in our prairies and in our foothills and mountains. Another finding, which was also very interesting, was a strong connection with the Canadian horse. That's Canada's national horse. And the Canadian horse is actually descended from French colonial horses, and they were probably brought west by early colonists coming from the east. And finally, we also have some traces of rare breeds of heavy horses. And those go back, they were probably the latest addition to the gene pool of our Wildies, and they came about in the early 20th century when mining and forestry companies shut down and simply let their horses go, and they kind of merged with the foundation herd that was already there. So they have a very, very colorful history indeed. And finally, again, still talking about the history, part of that history is also the fact that throughout the 20th century, their numbers were reduced to a minute fraction of what they once were. And that is due to bounty systems, it is due to indiscriminate killings, unregulated capture, and all these activities eventually pushed our wild horses to the brink of extinction, and that's where we find ourselves today.
Yeah, that's where we are today.
Yeah, exactly.
At some point earlier there, you said some of the evidence may have been suppressed, and I know that would be hundreds of years ago that happened. But why do you think?
No, not quite recently, actually, because whether wild it's a political issue for many First Nations and Native Americans, and it's also a political issue for whether these horses have a legitimate right to be here for those scientists as well as politicians who use what we like to call the Columbian curtain. Any animals that did not exist when Christopher Columbus stumbled onto these shores, lost as he was, has no legitimate right to be here. And that is utterly nonsensical, because when we look at the time frame, it's a very different time frame that we're looking at when we talk about human history. We have ecological time, we have geological time, and even in terms of ecological time, a couple of thousand years is not a whole lot.
No.
The ecosystems change much slower. And when we talk about ecosystems and animals disappearing over the last couple of thousand years, we have empty niches that still exist and that were basically filled by those European horses when they returned, being pretty much identical to the original North American horse. So there's a continuous line of ecological legitimacy, so to speak, that reaches up to our present time, and certainly makes a strong argument in favor of our Wildies having a pretty good right to be here.
Okay, for sure. Thank you. And I believe you answered, the North American horses are different than the Wildies of Alberta. I think you already answered that question. It was just next question.
That they're not really different. The next question concerned, I think, the Yukon horse.
Yeah, but because we're going to be talking about it, what is Equus lambe?
It's a Yukon horse. Equus lambe is the latest representative of the original North American horse that still survived. In all likelihood, they only went extinct about 5,000 years ago, not 10,000 years ago. And it was found by new research in molecular biology using mitochondrial DNA analysis, which did a lot to clarify the horse's family tree, which could be confusing. But what this research actually proved was that Equus lambe was virtually identical with Equus caballos, which is the European horse that came over to populate North America. And it's really interesting. I had a chance to view remains of these little horses a couple of years ago in the Yukon Beringia Interpretive Center in Whitehorse. And they are small horses. They are yellowish in color. They had long, yellowish flowing manes and tails. So they were very different from other primitive horses like Przewalski's horses or recreated tarpans. And they were very, very close. They were only pony size, large ponies. But they were very, very close genetically to our Wildies. In plain English, what that would mean, if our Wildies encountered these little horses as their contemporaries, they would be able to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. That does not happen with, as we all know, with our wonderful mules and hinnies, are offspring of horses and donkeys, but they can't produce foals in turn. But if these horses interbred, they would very successfully, in all likelihood, I mean, we will never know, but certainly judging from the closeness in their DNA, they would be able to create combined herds and increase their numbers. So they were that close. And that, again, goes to show that our wild horses, they are not alien introduced species who have no legitimate right to inhabit the ecosystem that they do inhabit, but they filled vacant ecological niches that were there in the first place. And that is proven by this close relationship with Equus lambe.
The Alberta government refers to wild horses as feral. Do you think that is the correct classification of these animals?
Well, words are powerful, and I don't have so much a problem with the term itself as I have with its use. Because the word feral is always used in a derogatory sense. And it is also wrongly associated with the element of being an alien, invasive, introduced species. And one has nothing to do with the other. So without this negative connotation, I would be perfectly happy to agree that our wild horses are feral, because their parentage, or they are descendants of horses removed many horse generations ago, hundreds of years of horse generations ago. They are descended from, in all likelihood, domestic horses. But that does not make them alien or introduced. They are native, and not only are they native, but they are also wild. They have never lost their complex social relationships and social behavior. They have formed symbiotic relationships with other wildlife species, and they are very successfully filling an ecological niche that was theirs for millennia. And as a result, they may be feral, but they are native, and they're also wild in every sense of the word. And since we are talking about semantics, there's another one. These horses are managed under the Stray Animals Act. Now, we all know what a stray animal is. It's temporarily replaced from its domestic environment. It has escaped. It has no place in the wild. And government quite often tells us that a lot of times some horses do escape, domestic horses escape. They quite often are also illegally released. We have a huge problem of very irresponsible horse ownership, of unwanted horses. And more often than not, they are very poorly equipped to survive in the wild. They are not automatically integrated into wild herds. And I remember more than 10 years ago, government was telling us that they are unable to distinguish between wild horses and escaped domestic horses. Well, we were always happy to help them because these domestic escapees, they are physically and behaviorally quite distinct from wild horses. And as I said, they are often very poorly equipped to survive and definitely in need of rescue. So there is a problem with horses being released and unwanted horses, and that's definitely something to be addressed by the horse industry. It's definitely also something to be addressed by government agencies, and hopefully with utmost attention to the humane treatment of these poor animals. But it really has nothing to do and is a very different issue from the situation of a long-established wild horse population. So it's, as I said, it's a totally different issue, and the government needs to be aware of that and not continuously misinforming the public that these are our wild horses who have been for hundreds of years are just recent barnyard escapees of indifferent lineage. So that's total nonsense and misinformation, which continues to be propagated.
Yeah, I actually know. I have a couple of friends that they're like, oh, they've been escaped from barns, and like now that the numbers are so low, there's some kind of credibility to it, but it's really it's nonsense, as I've found out myself. So yeah,
it only you don't even have to be a wild horse expert. Quite often, it's just common sense that tells you that you're being lied to and made a fool of.
And
it's sad but true.
And it doesn't feel nice to be lied to about it.
It doesn't,
right? And it's
but we're getting used to it.
Unfortunately,
you have to get used to it.
Here we go. Oh, can you tell us about the ecological role of horses? That's where we are now, right?
Yeah, it's, again, a really important question because the government is quite preoccupied with claiming ecological damage by wild horses without ever having been able to show us any kind of evidence of that. But it kind of takes away from the importance of ecological opportunities that are actually presented by wild horses. In the first place, wherever we have a greater number of species in any given ecosystem, we also have a more stable ecosystem because there is a give and take, there are checks and balances. And a really good example is actually the African savanna, where we have a huge number of predators and prey species. And interestingly enough, the African savanna is also the closest equivalent of what the Ice Age steppe used to be like before all those large mammals went extinct. And they went extinct likely due to a combination of factors, climate change, but also very efficient Stone Age hunters. So a larger number of species is definitely a plus for any kind of ecosystem. And we also know for a fact that our vegetation, be they forbs, grasses, shrubs, trees, they evolved, as we know them today, with the presence of a much larger number of species, and the horse is certainly being one of those species. So, as I said before, the horses do fill a vacant niche. They do fulfill a role in the ecosystem that we have today, and as a result, they enrich this ecosystem. Furthermore, when we talk about, particularly talking about wild horses as one of those many species, horses are also, of all herbivores, tend to be the most effective seeders. They have a very inefficient digestive system, and anybody who has dealt with horse poop knows perfectly well that a lot of what goes in front comes out in the back totally undamaged. That includes seeds. So horses, in a way, seed their own pastures to a much greater degree than other herbivores, because when we look at cut-chewing cattle, but also bison, deer and elk, sheep, antelope, all those ruminants are much more efficient in digesting and processing their feed, and as a result, they don't have the same seeding effect that horses would do. And furthermore, again, talking about foraging, due to the upper incisors, horses also have a particular way of eating their food. They nip it off above ground, whereas a lot of other herbivores pull it out by the roots. So that's, again, a way where horses most likely have a lesser impact on the vegetation that they use than other herbivores. And finally, there are a number of other factors, other benefits that horses have for other species and for the ecosystem. Is, for example, horse trails being used by other species in various environments, which has been very well documented. Also, crusted snow removals to access water and forage, which again is being taken advantage of by other herbivores, particularly smaller critters like deer and elk. And also the removal of coarse stands of grass, which is hugely important in fire prevention. I mean, we've heard a lot about the threat of fire in British Columbia and Alberta, and certainly having wild horses around to remove a lot of this dry and very tough vegetation, such as coarse grasses, would have a huge impact in fire prevention, and it also furthers spring grazing. Finally, horses also provide prey for predators, which takes predator pressure away from other species. Some government officials will tell you that also attracts predators, but that we have no evidence of that, and there's no scientific proof of that happening. So there are all sorts of things and all sorts of ways that wild horses have a very beneficial impact on their environment. Again, crediting the fact that they have been around for a long time, and that they continue to fulfill these roles in the ecosystem that they inhabit.
It's really interesting. I didn't know that they seeded so well. That's really cool. Okay, what problems do wild horses face today?
Lots. Well, we've already talked about that to a large degree, but at a most fundamental level, I think horses are probably amongst the most misunderstood wild animal that we have. They're in good company. I mean, they are certainly in the company of wolves and coyotes, who are also totally misrepresented in many ways. But at the most basic idea is probably to understand them as wild animals in the first place. Because horses have a complicated relationship with people by the very fact that, on the one hand, they have undertaken this leap into domestication, and then they reversed it by basically rewilding themselves and becoming wildlife and regaining their wild heritage. Looking at the relationship between humans and horses, arguably no other animal, and that includes man's best friend, the dog, is as deeply entrenched in our cultural fabric as the horse is. Because when we look back in prehistory and history, horses have inspired the arts. Even back in prehistory, when you think about the fantastic cave paintings in Spain and France, horses have revolutionized warfare, being hitched to chariots and being ridden by warriors. Horses have shaped societies. When you look back at the Middle Ages or at equestrian societies, horses have conquered continents. Think of how Mexico was lost to the Spanish and South America as well. People remember that. As a result, the very prominence of horses as a cultural being, so to speak, kind of complicates their encounter as a wild animal. And it's definitely problematic for a lot of people. And even when we look at Alberta, I mean, as a modern example, we look at the ranching community or the rodeo crowd. All these people claim to love horses, and in their way they do. But ranchers love their quarter horses helping with cattle. Mm-hmm. They love the entertainment of rodeos, chuck wagon racing with thoroughbreds and saddle and bareback bronc. Those are not wild horses. They're bred to buck. And if they don't buck hard enough, they go to slaughter. It's as simple as that. So it has nothing to do with wild horses. And there's definitely a disconnect in recognizing and appreciating horses as wildlife, as wild animals, and not just as a servant of man.
Yeah, because I think it was the invention, when Mongolia invented the stirrup, it completely changed the history of the world and in the way the world progressed.
Definitely.
It was a huge invention.
And it's always funny to look at historical films, and even the ancient Romans rode with stirrups all of a sudden, because no actor apparently can ride without stirrups. Yeah. So it's kind of funny. I laugh at these films every time, even documentaries.
Yeah. So because it's so hard to imagine even trying to ride or get on a horse without stirrups, but
I do it all the time.
Yeah, but they did for thousands of years, and then once it was invented,
and it certainly revolutionized warfare as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
yeah, that's how they were able to take over so much of the world.
Yeah.
The Alberta government is planning to cull 30 horses and dart 90 mares with contraception in the Elbow and Clearwater zones this winter. If they go ahead with those plans, what do you think the effects will be on the population of horses, on that population?
Yeah, it's going to be extremely negative. Overall, we are already dealing with a low population. Now I'm talking about the 1,500 populating the whole of the eastern slope. And this low population is, well, it's at best static, it's at worst declining. And furthermore, we have a very low foal survival rate. We don't have a systematic study of foal survival, like recruitment from baby to yearling, but anecdotal evidence as well as, and particularly citizen science, has really convincingly shown that in all likelihood that survival rate is no higher than 10 or 15%. And under these circumstances, the very idea of rendering 90 mares infertile over several years is just totally ludicrous. And for me personally, it's also an indicator of an effort to basically manage these horses out of existence. There is no other way of putting it. Then the next thing, removing 30 stallions, another real blow to the population, not to mention the impact on these individuals, because what do you do with 30 stallions? They may not be suitable for domestic life. It's easier when you remove babies or rescue babies, as we have seen on many occasions, but if you take a mature stallion and with the hope of turning them into a riding horse or domestic horse, sometimes it works, but it can be very, very problematic. And we have a pretty good idea of where they go if things don't work out for them. And finally, and furthermore, we also have to think about the social impact on equine society. We are dealing with elders. We are dealing with leaders. We are dealing with families. We are dealing with bonded pairs. We are dealing with friends, because people usually don't recognize the complexity of equine society. And if you totally remove individuals from those populations, the social impact is just as strong as the physical impact. And then looking at those two zones, the Clearwater zone borders on the Sundre zone. And so we have movement of horses between those zones. But Clearwater has also, particularly over this year, been subject to illegal removals and poaching of wild horses, which has been another blow to the population level. And furthermore, there is also very legitimate concern about the accuracy of counts, particularly on the border of those two zones, because there has been double counting, over several days, and we have already proven that there were serious issues with horse counts in the Clearwater zone, and these issues are going to continue.
Battery. It says battery saver.
Oh, okay, let me plug that in. Sorry.
Thank you so much for listening to part 1 of my interview with Dr. Claudia Notzke on the Wildy West. It really means a lot to me to see people interested in this topic, and I genuinely do want to see these beautiful horses saved. A huge thank you to Claudia for allowing me to interview her in this episode, and a huge thank you to everyone else I was lucky enough to interview this season. If you want to help, there are a ton of different things you can do. If you live in Canada, you can write to your local member of parliament or directly to the Minister of Parks in Alberta. If you're not as comfortable doing that, you may wish to follow the Help Alberta Wildies Society or HAWS on Facebook to get more involved and see what other things you can do. And of course, you can like, comment, or interact with this podcast in any way. Every little bit truly does help and allows me to show tangible proof that people care. If you'd be so kind as to share this with friends or family that you think might be interested in this topic, or who you think would want to help, I would really appreciate it. Tune in next week for part 2 of this interview, where I will also be sharing the incredible true story of Dr. Claudia's first encounter with wild horses. If you would like to follow us on social media, you can find us on Twitter or X and Blue Sky using the tag @TheWildyWest. For any business inquiries, please contact us at thewildywest@gmail.com. I'm your host, Chase McGorn. Thank you once again for listening to the Wildy West.